everybody, welcome back. This is the second in my experimental series, and on screen you can see some of the experiments that I've been doing recently. And I'm going to show you one quick experiment using the pour technique, and then I'm going to go on to show you some experiments using a kind of printing technique, which proved so successful that I used it in my Koi Carp batik painting, and you'll get a preview of that right at the end. But before we get to that, let's start with the first experiment. Okay, so I've got a frame here which is stapled onto it an embroidery mesh that you can buy, and hopefully that's going to give me the stability that I need for the cloth so it doesn't bow, but also allow it to seep through the fibres and be tapped through a little bit. So I just stapled that to my frame. I can take it off at the end. I've just put it down with basic staples. And just as an interesting side note, I'm actually working with ChatGPT on this, and AI is incredibly good for experimental work and giving suggestions of chemicals and things that can work together well. And this particular technique was suggested to me by my AI friend. So I cut a piece of pre-soaked lawn cotton to size, and then it was time to turn to the alginates and gels that I wanted to use with my dyes. And I wanted to mix up a reasonably thin gel and just pour that onto the cloth. It's really just taking this idea of having a small layer between the dyes and the cloth before they've moved around, and then the idea being you can try and tap them through so you almost takes a snapshot of what's there. So I've mixed up two dye gels. One of them is a strong dark red and the other one is a golden yellow. But the golden yellow is substantially weaker than the magenta based colour, and I want to see whether the magenta based dye will overwhelm the yellow or whether they'll mix nicely together. And that's one of the things I'm going to try and observe in this. But really all I'm trying to do is just put a load of dye down, observe what's there on my cloth, and then compare that to the results. Now I picked up some of the clear alginate in a pipette and I've put that in various places on the cloth. The big hole that you can see that's been created, I put the alginate right on the surface of the fabric and then squeezed it out from the pipette. On the other ones I left it on the surface to see if it would push the dyes out the way, and they have reacted and behaved in slightly different ways. The next thing I did was then just pour some alginate around the outside of where the dyeing was going on, because I wanted to try and encourage the whole thing to spread out a little bit. Then I just started lightly tapping my frame, the idea being I'm going to try and tap through that layer of alginate on the bottom and get the dyes to connect to the fabric. Well, that's the plan anyway. Then, because there was quite a lot of dye at the bottom, I just scraped out a little bit of the dye that's on the surface over onto the alginate. And I wanted to see what textures would appear and whether there was anything that might replicate cells in any way. So at this point I showed some restraint and decided to stop. And this is what it looked like straight after I'd poured the dyes onto the fabric. I then left it for 12 to 14 hours in my warm kitchen, covered in cellophane, and after I removed the cellophane, this is what it looked like. And you can see it's softened quite a bit, but not as much as I was expecting. But what I have noticed is that alginate that I put directly on the fabric, and you can see roughly in the middle of this screen, well, that's disappeared. But the ones I put on the surface, they stayed. After that, I just washed, dried and ironed my piece of fabric, and this is the final piece of cloth. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that, as you can see, like everything that's got a magenta base to it, and I was expecting this dye to be quite red, has in fact come out a pink purplish colour, and I think that's quite interesting just to note again how dramatically different when you're using magenta dyes. What you see what's wet and what you see when it's cured are very different colours. There's some interesting things going on, but as I suspected, the yellow has been dominated and overwhelmed by the magenta in the other stronger dye, and hasn't really got much of effect on anything other than when it's just on the white cloth itself. Okay, so I'm going to split the screen again and show you three things. First, straight after it was poured. In the middle, it's after it was cured but not washed. And at the end, it's washed, dried and ironed. And you can compare and see the changes that have gone on. And if you look at this first one, yes, everything is a lot more subtle, but it is all there. The yellow has been much paler than I was expecting it to be, but I did know I diluted that down quite a lot, so I was expecting it to be pale. It's just a shame that those beautiful swirls at the top aren't more dominant. And as expected, although reasonably faint, those threads that I pulled out of dye, they've remained. They've thickened slightly and softened a tiny bit, but they're still there, and I still think that is a technique I am definitely going to be using in my work. Okay, so that's the end of that first experiment. I think I've learnt a lot from it. I think it was interesting to look and compare them next to each other. And I've come to the conclusion that using this sort of method, you definitely get a much softer results than I'm kind of looking for. So onwards and upwards and on to the next experiment. Okay, so I thought I'd try a different angle at this. And this time I've got myself a printing pad and I'm going to actually pour onto the pad. And then I'm going to try and take a print of it. So I'm just literally just playing around with the dyes here, just, putting something down. As I said, at the moment, I'm not really that bothered about something looking pretty. I want to see the effects that are going on, and then I can use it in a much more effective way. And with this, I sprayed some silicone onto the pad because I'm hoping that I can actually get some sort of cell or texture going on. I don't care terribly much about the colours and anything like that. And I think the dye that I've just put down was the remainders of a disastrous pour that I did in an earlier experiment. And so it's got some variations in it, and that's fine. This is really just to see if this different approach will be better. Now, the other colour I'm putting down is the same magenta-based dye that I used in the previous experiment, and adding that to the printing pad too, and just going to see how they interact with each other. These ones should be reasonably balanced in terms of strength and thickness of the gels, so we'll see what happens. The printer's pad is on a piece of perspex, which is why I can pick it up and move it around a bit. And this time I'm being a lot more gentle than I did in the last video and my first experiment. But I do still want to see what happens when I stretch it out. And I just pop some of the alginate down, just try to connect that with the blob of dye that's there and see if I can stretch it out some more that way. At this point, as usual, it's a load of sludge. And so far the silicone spray has done absolutely nothing. But I don't mind so much. And the reason for that is because this is a test to see what I can get out of it in terms of textures. So now I'm scraping out. Remember, I put that silicone down and you can see that I am actually getting texture, which of course I got all so excited about. But we'll see at the end whether they stayed. And I'm not going to take a print of the entire pad. I'm going to select an area of it to take a print of, and I'll do some more with the dye that's left on there. And those textures there are beautiful. And if I can capture those, I think I'll be quite happy. So as I said, I'm concentrating on texture here, not the big sludge that's in the middle. That was really just the starting point. And as expected, that really just merged all together. It doesn't like being moved around. But I'm now going to take a print off of that textured area at the top. So I just laid down a piece of long cotton that had been pre-soaked in soda ash. I'm just gently tapping down to allow the fabric to absorb the dyes that are there on that printing pad. You'll be very gentle because you don't want to squish it out too much. And where I've pulled it out to get that texture, the dye there is quite thin, so I'm hoping I'll get some sharper lines. So I just left that for about a minute just to soak in a little bit. Don't want to leave it too long. And then I just lifted it back off of the printing pad, laid it down on a flat surface, covered it in cellophane and put it in my kitchen to cure. Sorry, I think I'm showing my age. Cellophane is plastic wrap. So here it is, just after I'd printed it. And here it is cured, washed and dried. And I think you can see everything is an awful lot sharper. It's also an awful lot more intense in its colour, so I guess that's where I was going wrong. The alginate was sticking there below the dyes when I was putting it onto the cloth, and the dyes were barely hitting the fabric. Whereas this way, they're sitting on the surface, and when I print it, they go straight on the fabric. And that's brilliant. So if I show you experiment 1 again, and then experiment 2, you can see what I mean. And so I'm definitely going to continue and do some more printing. So for this next quick experiment, I basically just used up old gels and old dyes that were hanging around, and I'm using an orange from a pour and a very weak sort of kind of green sludge colour. Now you're coming on a little late to this one, and literally all I've done is I've put down this olive green, which is just a waste piece of gel, which I'm using kind of as just the second colour. And I very carefully just put down onto the surface a small drop of the orange, let that spread out and settle for a few minutes. Then I added a small drop of this olive green colour, let that spread out a bit, and continued to do that until there were 5 or 6 rings that were being created. I then just picked up some more of the green alginate and just put some small dots of that in some of the rings just to see if I could distort them, and if I could, what they would look like at the end. So then I grabbed a piece of cloth, again pre-soaked in soda ash, and laid it over the top. I just left that for a few moments, allowing the dyes to completely soak through the fabric. I then removed it, put it on a piece of perspex, and left it for about 10 minutes just to settle. And then I did something I don't normally do. I picked up a squeegee and I scraped the surface. Now the rationale for that is that when you pick up the alginate and the dye's on the surface and it hits the fabric, but then you take some alginate with you, and that then is heavy and it settles and it pulls the dye with it, which makes all of the lines that you've got an awful lot softer. So by just letting it soak into the fabric and then taking that top layer of alginate away with a squeegee, I'm hoping that although the dyes may be a little less strong, I'm going to get better results. And so that was what it looked like after the print, and here's what it looked like to dry. And I think you can agree I'm finally getting somewhere, although I'm not sure that the scraping had any real effect, to be honest. So this leads me to the final experiment I'm going to show you today, and the one that's going to take me nearest to my goal, which is to find a technique for my Koi Carp batik painting. And this time I'm going large. So after all these experiments, I think it was time for me to actually try and create the water for the pond for my Koi Carp batik painting. And for this, I've made some cardboard cutouts of the Koi Carp fish, and I've stuck them onto the acetate in the positions they will be in when I do my batik painting. And I want to just see how the dyes flow around those objects and whether there's something in that could potentially indicate movement. So next I mixed up a reasonably thick gel, probably a bit like what would be known as heavy cream or double cream to us in the UK. Then it was time for me to turn my attention to my dyes. I mixed up a turquoise, and then I made a slightly lighter turquoise. I mixed up a green made from the turquoise and lemon yellow, and then I mixed up a blue which was made from the turquoise and the magenta. Now, to make sure these dyes are nice and strong, I mixed equal amounts of water with dye powder and left them in little pots, shook them, agitated them and left them overnight. So there is a very, very strong dye concentration in those little pots. And I'm hoping that if I use that plus an equal amount of the alginate, I should get the punchy colours that I'm after. So then I picked up my alginate and just laid down a little bit of that just to indicate the direction in which I want my dyes to flow. And then I added the dyes, again circular motions and replicating the flow of the water between the fish. Then I picked up the green and added, again, more circles in that. And then I just popped the darker green in some of the places just to indicate bubbles and just more shapes in the flow of the dyes. And of course I got myself completely carried away and put way too much dye onto the acetate. And I've learnt now that less is very much more when it comes to this type of technique with thickened dyes. Anyway, because I couldn't leave well alone, I then picked up the alginate and tried to make some bubbles and some voids of white on the acetate. To be honest, at that point I was quite excited, and there was definitely some inference of flow of water, which was what I was trying to achieve. So I removed the fabric after taking the print, laid that down on a flat net on one of my frames so that the dyes could sink through and not then pool underneath. And when I looked at it, I was a little concerned that some of the alginates were going to spread too much into the fish shapes. So I decided to add gel to those fish shapes in order to push back the gels and hopefully keep a void there. Then, because I wasn't satisfied fiddling enough, I decided to put some dots on there. Why? I have no idea. And I think this is the problem, is I get so wrapped up in enjoying the process that I just don't know when to stop. And finally, I added some salt to the outside of it because I wanted to frame it with some sort of texture, even though my ability to do salt dyeing hasn't really been that successful. Then I left it in my kitchen, which is about 75 degrees or above most of the time, and I left that to cure wrapped in cling film. After a full 24 hours, I brought it back into my studio, took off the cling film, and this is what it looked like before it was washed. And this is what it looked like once it was washed, dried and ironed. And I think you can see the dramatic difference in colours. And I think I know what's going on there. You see, the magenta is a much heavier type of particle than the yellow and the turquoise. So that will hit the surface much more quickly, and therefore it will dominate the way the dyes are on the fabric. And it looks like the yellow is then the second most dense particle. That has definitely hit the fabric way before the turquoise. And the turquoise, well, it's being completely dominated and overpowered by the other two colours. And around the edges, well, it looked like the turquoise just got sucked up by that salt. Now, the other reason why the turquoise has failed to a certain extent with this dye is that maybe my kitchen wasn't quite as warm as I thought it was. And I do know that the turquoise dye does need to be at a good warm temperature to cure properly. So it's probably a combination of the two things, but that doesn't really matter because I'm going to do further dyes and I can adjust all these colours. And on that very note, here's the background I created in this video. And here's the batik I made from it. And in the next video, I'm going to explain exactly how I did it. But until then, thank you for watching. I hope this has inspired a few people. And until the next time, remember that whatever you do today, just make it creative.